Have you ever scrolled through the internet and found yourself losing faith in humanity at some of the historical inaccurate comments people make? If you want to keep an optimistic view of the world, maybe skip this video, because I'm gonna be responding to some of the dumbest bad history takes about Al-Andalus, the medieval Iberian territories under Islamic rule. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and today I will debunk myths about the Muslim conquest, legacy, and Christians under the rule. Let's go! Clown! Christianity is peace! The violent ones were the Muslims! Tell that to the pagans, Jews, or Muslims forced to convert to Christianity. The Christian wars of conquest against Al-Andalus, the Crusades, European imperialist projects, Franco's dictatorship, or even more recent Christian terrorist actions like those of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. Religions have often been used to justify wars and oppress people, so claiming that Christianity is peace shows that the clown here is you. A far-right influencer tweeted this on January the 2nd. January the 2nd, 532 years since the conquest of Granada. 532 years since the expulsion of evil. If we did it back then, we can do it again, starting by ending the regime of 1978. Expelling the evil to refer to the conquest of the last Muslim stronghold? For real? By ending the regime of 1978, he's referring to the current political regime in Spain, created in the transition to democracy from Francoism. He doesn't want to end parliamentary democracy to make the country more free, but because he wants a fascist dictatorship without Muslims. Should we remind him that his beloved Francisco Franco brought over 80,000 Moroccans to Spain to overthrow the legitimate government and democracy and massacre thousands of Spaniards? Certainly, it's a part of our history we should forget. The darkest period of our history, the Muslim invasion. Should we forget history? Is he talking about erasing history and pretending nothing happened? Sorry, but are you one of the Gorosei from One Piece? And how is it the darkest period? Not to mention he calls the Muslim conquest an invasion. If you use this kind of language for the Arab and Berber conquest, why don't you also talk about the Roman invasion of Hispania, the Christian invasion of Al-Andalus, or the Spanish invasions of the Americas? If you use this kind of language for the Arab and Berber conquest, why don't you also talk about the Roman invasion of Hispania, the Christian invasion of Al-Andalus, or the Spanish invasions of the Americas? I don't expect an answer since I already know the double standard nationalists have. In my Spanish show, I have often explained it is wrong to call the Muslim conquest an invasion, because that word is used to delegitimize the entire existence of Al-Andalus, while people don't use that word for other conquests. This user commented that the Spanish conquests in the Americas were very different because the natives collaborated with the Castilians as they preferred them as rulers, implying that there was no native collaboration with the Arab and Berber conquerors. Clearly, she doesn't know much about the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which I will cover in detail in a future episode, so please subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss it. Before, during, or after the decisive Battle of Guadalete, King Witiza's family made pacts with the Berber conquerors. Duke Theodomir in southeastern Iberia capitulated to the Arabs. The Banu Qasi in La Rioja also made agreements. And the same can be said about cities like Seville, Medina Sidonia, or Merida. There was also collaboration from the bishoprics of Hispania and Septimania with the Muslim conquerors, which was crucial for Andalusi administration and tax collection in the first century and a half of Muslim rule. There was so much collaboration that Frankish ruler Charles Martel destroyed the walls of numerous cities in the region of Septimania, in southern France, to punish the collaboration between the Goths and the clergy with the Arabs. In every conquest, there are native collaborators, some willing, others forced, and others simply adapting to the new circumstances to try to preserve their power and properties. This Galician nationalist got mad at me because in one of my videos in Spanish, I talk about why Galicians have the highest proportion of genes from the Maghreb, from northwestern Africa, among Spaniards. And he said, "Don't say nonsense, it's the Andalusians. We Galicians are Celts. Liar, there were never any Muslims in Galicia." To start, the pre-Roman Galiki peoples of modern-day Galicia were Indo-Europeans with their own culture, but influenced by the Celts. But they weren't Celts themselves. And of course, Romanization followed, so saying Galicians are Celts today is a very dumb take. The statement that no Muslims were ever in Galicia is factually wrong, just by the fact that today there are Muslims in Galicia. But also in the Middle Ages there were Muslims. Musa ibn Nusayr and Tariq ibn Ziyad conquered Lugo and other cities in present-day Galicia in 714. With the Great Berber Revolt that also affected Al-Andalus in the 740s and the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus, Islamic administration in Galicia fell apart. But that doesn't mean all Arabs and Berbers who had settled there left. Even under the Astur-Leonese kingdom, there were both free and enslaved Muslims living in Galicia. For example, the Berber warrior Mahmud ibn Abdal-Jabbar with his followers and families, who were invited to Galicia by King Alfonso II of Asturias himself. Campaigns by King Ordoño II of Galicia in 913 or Ordoño III of León in 955 against the territories of modern-day Portugal and Extremadura resulted in thousands of Muslim captives taken to the north. But that comment is nothing compared to this denier. Mister, there was no Arab conquest but Islamization, Dito Lagüe, nor conquest of America but indigenous social revolution. For those unfamiliar with this theory, there are fake historians like Ignacio Lagüe or Emilio González Ferrín who deny that the Muslim conquest ever occurred. They argue that there was a spontaneous Arabization and Islamization without Arabs and Berbers colonizing Al-Andalus. This is obviously pure scientific fraud. It denies the abundant documentary, archaeological, toponymic, genetic, and many other types of evidence confirming the Islamic conquest. But with these deniers, it's hard to reason because no matter how much evidence you present, they will stick to their version. Related to this conspiracy of what they call official history, there are deniers of the possibility of knowing history if you weren't there when events happened. Were you there? How well you are preserved? You were there and saw it? I don't believe anything from official history. If they lie to us about what's happening now, imagining with what happened centuries ago. According to these brainless people, we will then be able to talk about history or any contemporary event for that matter. We will then be able to discuss political news, criminal cases, or even talk to friends about things that happened to them or that they heard, because how could you know if it's true what they are telling you if you weren't there to verify it? And it also starts from a false assumption that people observing the same events will interpret them the same way. Each person has their own ideas, interests, and subjectivity. There is no official history. Historical knowledge is constantly revised by different researchers who often present different and even contradictory views. We're getting closer and closer to historical reality, even though absolute truth will always be unattainable, because it does not exist or depends on the point of view you adopt to study something. This user wrote this on TikTok. Al-Andalus was the biggest center for trafficking women and children. In 8 centuries, no roads, no bridges, no industries, just enslaved women and children, and looting. Al-Andalus did capture and traffic slaves, and it was one of their major exports and imports, like in most other European and Mediterranean medieval countries. However, Al-Andalus was not a slave society. This means that its social and economic model was not based on slavery, like it happened in some Caribbean countries in the early modern era. The slave trade was one economic activity among others, but it wasn't a society that exploited slaves or serfs to work the land. Rome brought civilization, aqueducts, theaters, etc. to savages. The Arabs didn't even build a damn aqueduct, just slavery. The Romans enslaved tens of thousands of natives from Hispania. So what is this guy talking about? And on top of that, he calls the pre-Roman natives savages? The real savages were the Romans, capable of massacring thousands of people, like for instance Servius Sulpicius Galba, who tricked the Lusitanians by promising them land, and when they lowered their weapons, he killed almost all of them. The most savage, the most genocidal, are always those who portray themselves as the most civilized. Powerful states bring out the worst in humanity, and they have the means to commit genocide. You won't find an example of any pre-Roman people committing massacres even remotely similar to those of the Romans. Saying that Rome brought civilization because they built aqueducts or theaters while the Andalusis didn't is like comparing apples to oranges. By late antiquity, old theaters and amphitheaters had been occupied and generally used as residential areas for new houses to build on top of them. By the time the Arabs and Berbers arrived, many didn't even know what theaters and amphitheaters had been used for. Each culture has its own spaces, and this comparison is as absurd as saying the Romans were uncivilized because they didn't build mosques or pyramids. Again, on the issue of calling it Muslim invasion instead of conquest, we don't talk about Roman invasion of Spain, nor a Spanish invasion of the Americas, but we say Muslim invasion of Spain because while Romans and Spaniards invested in improving the well-being of the people of the country, like building roads and aqueducts for cities, universities, hospitals, etc., the Muslims did none of this. They only built a few palaces and mosques for some Muslim lords. Differences. Since you want to create educational content, read and learn a bit before you make a fool of yourself. This is another example of Eurocentric and supremacist propaganda of the civilized vision of the Western world against the supposed insignificance and despotism of other cultures. Of course, this view is far from reality. The Andalusis, which by the way were mostly of native descent, built many infrastructures to improve people's lives and to maximize economic profit, including roads, irrigation channels, wells, mills, baths, workshops, markets, shipyards, hospitals, and schools. In contrast, education and literacy in contemporary Christian countries were laughable, and mainly controlled by the clergy. On a TikTok video about how a Spanish far-right party uses medieval history, someone boldly left this comment. Difference is in the Americas they speak Spanish and in Spain we don't speak Arabic, so the Arabs didn't bring much culture. I mean, seriously, can someone explain how this guy graduated? Not from high school, but from elementary school? Maybe the fact that Arabic isn't spoken in Spain today has something to do with the systematic policy of eradicating Arabic culture and the expulsion, enslavement, or forced conversions of Andalusis. Just a minor detail. Moreover, it's also problematic to talk about the Arabs brought this or that. This is a form of alienating Arabic culture, making it something foreign, when in reality many Andalusis of Arab, Berber, or native Iberian descent made contributions to science and culture throughout the history of Al-Andalus. So far, do you notice a pattern in these comments? Devaluation of the legacy of Al-Andalus, desires to erase the Islamic past, and denial of any Islamic contributions. The Muslims conquered Hispania by force and forced many people to convert to Islam. They didn't allow Catholic churches on the peninsula, but Spain accepts mosques. Isn't that inequality? Except they did allow churches. There wasn't widespread persecution or forced conversions to Islam until the Almohads arrived in the mid-12th century, after more than 500 years of Islamic rule. Later, Almohad caliphs and the Nasrid kingdom of Granada reinstated the dhimmi status, allowing Christians and Jews in their territories. However, by that time, the damage to religious minorities was beyond repair. The tax burden was unbearable. Faithful Christians chose voluntary martyrdom due to religious intolerance. No coexistence at all. The ones who collected taxes from Christians were fellow Christians, mainly the clergy. That's why many Christians facing tax increases left the church and converted to Islam. But there were other, probably more significant reasons why many Christians became Muslims. The issue of the voluntary martyrs of Córdoba, which he references, will be covered in a future episode. But to summarize it, there were only 48 Christians, mainly from Córdoba, who consciously did things they knew would lead to their execution under Islamic rule. The vast majority of Christians were not radicals and opposed the actions of these agitators who threatened peaceful relationships between Christians and Muslims living in Al-Andalus. In Al-Andalus, Christians were enslaved. It's not debatable. It's history. In fact, it's not only debatable, but entirely refutable. The only Christians who could be enslaved were those from the northern peninsula, as they were not part of the Islamic world, or those within Al-Andalus who violated the legal rules of dhimmis, the peoples of the book, meaning Christians and Jews, who accepted living under Islamic authority under certain conditions in exchange for protection of their lives, religion, and properties. Lies! The few Christians left fled north. Just look at the names of towns in Castile. This guy thinks there was a genocide of Christians when the Arabs and Berbers conquered Iberia. I don't know what he's trying to prove with the names of towns in Castile, but if he wants me to talk about the names of Castilian towns, I can. In what used to be the county of Castile, mainly in what's now the province of Burgos, close to Basque Country, we have place names of clear Arab and Islamic origin, like Sarracin, that comes from Saracen, one of the ways to refer to Arabs in antiquity, or Mahamud, a town named after the prophet of Islam, Muhammad. This and much more evidence show that Arabs and Berbers settled in the north as a result of the Muslim conquest. This writer and lover of the Roman Empire complained when he was called out for ignoring the legacy of the Islamic world. Among other things, he says he doesn't understand the desire to defend a culture like the Islamic one that doesn't make you fear, especially when we talk about women. It's absurd for this fan of the Romans to say this when ancient Roman society was one of the most patriarchal. From them we inherited Roman law, which until recently treated women as minors or people with disabilities, unable to do many basic things without a man's approval, whether it was the father, brother, husband, or son. He tops it off by saying, "If you want to be Moors, that's your problem. I prefer to be Roman." But if you call him a xenophobe, he will get mad. So far we have seen comments against Al-Andalus. Now let's address some bad history takes from people who idealize Al-Andalus or from nostalgic Muslims who whitewash Arab expansionism. Know that the peninsula was literally wild. The Arabs civilized them. I give this guy a 0 in originality. The civilizing justification for imperialism is very overused. Like, come up with something more original, man. Literally, all imperial powers claim they will civilize, but even if they build infrastructures to justify it, there will be unequal treatment between the conqueror and the conquered, exploitation of the conquered resources, and cultural assimilation and religious conversion. This claim that the Arabs came to civilize denies the existence of culture in the Visigothic Kingdom, Roman Hispania, or pre-Roman Iberia. On Twitter, for example, I saw this comment from a Muslim calling for Spain and Portugal to disappear and be replaced by a new Al-Andalus with the descendants of expelled Muslims and Moriscos as revenge for the ethnic and religious cleansing by Christians. It's well known that a terrorist organization like ISIS also called for the restoration of Al-Andalus. From Spain or the West in general, we don't realize this much due to the language barrier. But in the Arab world, there are many people who feel nostalgia for Al-Andalus and who whitewash the Muslim conquests. So much so that in Arabic, they refer to them as Fath, which means opening, as if countries open their doors peacefully and without resistance to Islam. In Spanish, it's like those people who talk about the liberation of the Americas, instead of calling it a conquest. Nostalgists and whitewashers of empires exist everywhere, and the Arab world is no exception. In Al-Andalus, several religions coexisted. The main proof is the possibility of mixed marriages in Islam. When he says mixed marriages, he refers to interfaith marriages. But what this guy doesn't mention is that only Muslim men could marry Christian and Jewish women under Islamic rule. Marriages between a Christian or Jewish man and a Muslim woman were prohibited. This is because from the Arab patriarchal mentality, children were raised in the father's religion, so the mother's religion was considered irrelevant. All Abrahamic religions condemned interfaith marriages for fear of losing followers, especially women and their children, and the possibility of heresies and contamination of the faith's purity. In any case, marriages and concubinage between Muslim men and Christian women were a demonstration of Muslim superiority and humiliation to Christians because sex is power. Then, among the historical nonsense is the myth of Convivencia in Al-Andalus, meaning the myth of a peaceful coexistence of the three Abrahamic religions on equal terms. Here we have an example of a statement in the Spanish Congress of a former deputy and Andalusian nationalist. In Al-Andalus, three cultures coexisted. It was the Spanish monarchy that caused a huge invasion, genocide, and concealment. I can say it is false to talk about three cultures. A religion is not the same as a culture. Al-Andalus was a country of Arab culture, as the native Latin and Berber cultures were eventually assimilated. Regardless of being Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, Andalusis adopted the Arabic language, Arabic names, and even some Islamic customs that Christians and Jewish Andalusis ended up imitating due to social customs. Regarding religious tolerance in Al-Andalus, like the rest of the Islamic world, Al-Andalus was a changing reality, which should be obvious given that it was a civilization that lasted several centuries. In the early centuries, when the Muslim population was a minority, they had no choice but to be tolerant and not impose harsh discrimination against Christians and Jews. From the 11th century onwards, given that most people had already converted to Islam, and given the rise of Christian powers in the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean world as a whole, the antagonism between Christians and Muslims increased. There were episodes of religious repression, like the 1066 Granada pogrom that resulted in thousands of Jews being killed. With the arrival of the Almoravid dynasty in the late 11th century, they imposed more restrictions on the non-Muslim population, but still within the limits of Islamic law. It was the Almohad dynasty that replaced the Almoravids in the mid-12th century, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, who forced the conversion of Christians and Jews, massacred or expelled them, confiscated their properties, and destroyed their temples, justifying that in their heretical interpretation of Islam. Therefore, there cannot be a monolithic view on religious tolerance in Al-Andalus, just as in the Christian kingdoms things evolved too, and there were periods in which the Jews under the Christians were well treated, even more than in Al-Andalus. What was common throughout the Andalusi period was that dhimmis, meaning Christians and Jews, had to recognize the religious superiority and political dominance of Islam and accept the conditions and restrictions of their status as a protected population within the Islamic world. Therefore, within Muslim territories, Christianity and Judaism were never seen as religions on par with Islam because Islam was regarded as the true faith. There was no concept of respecting all religions equally as liberalism proclaims. Instead, it was a relationship of subordination of other religions to Islam. That's why it's a mistake to talk about convivencia as if there were different faiths living in harmony and equality, and instead there was religious coexistence with the political and social dominance of one religion. To end these bad history takes on a lighter note, we have this absurd comment. There was no Islamic influence! The Islamic government of Hispania is an invention of the Separatists. The Visigothic government was never touched. Turns out everything I have told you so far was a lie. You have wasted all these minutes listening to me talk about a country that never existed. But it was fun, wasn't it? If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I would love to know if you enjoyed this format of response video. Thanks for watching and see you next time.